Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming back for the second of three in our series about how to manage risk in your supply chain using BSI's mesh methodology. Last time we spoke a bit about how to manage the sort of internal difficulties you may be having managing across your teams, different teams that are involved in managing risk in the supply chain, like your purchasing, sourcing, procurement, and supply chain teams, along with teams like trade compliance, sustainability, supplier quality, how to work out sort of those internal issues. Today, we're going to talk a bit about how to map the supply chain. So once you've figured out internally what's preventing you from effectively managing risk in the supply chain, you're going to look externally to get a better understanding of what risk looks like outside in your external supply chain. So we'll walk through sort of step by step today how to manage that risk or how to understand what risk actually looks like in your supply chain. It sounds very simple, but we find that a lot of the companies that we work with and a lot of the people that we're talking to are not really effectively mapping their supply chain. They're not doing it in a way that effectively identifies the risks that or threats that outside actors or other issues can pose to their supply chains, and they're not keeping that supply chain map live, if you will. So they may have done this as an exercise 3, 4, 5 years ago, but by now they've had an acquisition, they've developed new products, and the supply chain has completely changed. So the map they have of the supply chain is no longer an accurate representation or picture of the types of risks they're facing in their supply chain. Just a quick note here, I'm going to talk a little bit about mapping the supply chain kind of as a process. I know there's a lot of different tools out there. BSI has tools as well that can help with mapping the supply chain, but I think it's really important to nail the actual process. And part of this is working really effectively with your procurement and supply chain teams to understand what's out there in the supply chain and what risks you might be facing. So I'll talk through the process. We find that it's always better to get that process down, and then you can use a tool to scale it, overlay risk on top. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but we'll stay sort of focused on the process of mapping risk in the supply chain. So just as a reminder, this is BSI's mesh methodology. It's laid out here in a linear fashion, but really think of it as sort of a circle or a kind of infinite loop because unfortunately for us, supply chain risk management never really ends. It's something that we continue to adapt and change over time as the risks and our businesses change as well. So last time we talked a little bit about the program development and design phase. Today we're going to talk a little bit about risk mapping. In our next session, we'll talk a bit about sort of designing the sort of audit programs, assessment programs, and driving continuous improvement in the supplier base and what KPIs we use to measure that over time. But today we're really going to focus on number two. It's getting sort of its own little session here because we think it's just that important, basically, to map the supply chain and assess the current level of risks. Because from there, you can then take action on the different parts of the supply chain where you see the highest level of risk. One of the biggest issues we see is, well, companies usually have either one of two issues. The first is that their supply chains are so large, hundreds or thousands of suppliers, that they're not really sure where to start. The other issue we see is that the concentration of risk or concentration of value is in a few small parts of the supply chain. So they either have a problem with scale or a problem with concentration of risk in a particular part of the supply chain. So what mapping does is can help with either of those problems. It can either help with the issue of, hey, we have 500, 1,000, 2,000 suppliers. We need to understand where to focus our sort of limited resources in managing risk in the supply chain. So going from that list, get 500, from 500, 1,000, 2,000, down to maybe the 100, 200, 250 that we really need to worry about because they're going to cause 80% of the problems in our supply chain because of where they're located, because of the type of operations they have, those sorts of things. To solve that other problem where there's really high concentration of risk or really high concentration of value in a few small parts of the supply chain mapping can happen there. It can help there because it helps us really pinpoint, okay, this one supply chain, this one lane, these two suppliers, these are the ones where we have 80% or 70% of the value in our supply chain. So we really, really need to focus there. And you won't know that until you map out the supply chain. So again, we talked in the previous session about sort of mapping those requirements. What are the requirements that you're going to need to face? Is there a need to avoid disruption in the supply chain? Are there sustainability regulations that you'll need to meet? Are there quality requirements that your buyers may have that you need to meet? Are there expectations from your customers to be able to distribute in certain ways in certain places, either direct to customers, to distributors, those sorts of things? So what are the actual constraints on your supply chain? Think about those first before you begin mapping, because that'll change the way that you map. it'll determine sort of how you align the variables for your supply chain mapping. So if you're looking at a particular type of, let's say, sustainability regulation, you want to look at the ones that are sort of in scope for that sustainability regulation and understand how each supplier, as you map out the supply chain, maps to that requirement. So when we say mapping, it sounds like we're just putting dots on a map, but really we're also mapping sort of requirements. We're mapping capabilities of those suppliers, and we're getting a better understanding of sort of where they sit in the supply chain. Are they at a choke point in the supply chain? Are they the only supplier that does X or Y type of service? Are they located in a very high risk area and they perform a really high value service? In which case they should go to the top of your list in terms of managing risk in the supply chain. So take those requirements that hopefully you've mapped in the first session, which we talked about, take those requirements and then sort of overlay them on the map of the supply chain, or understand how you would overlay them on the map of the supply chain. This is just a very, very simplified version of a supply chain map, and obviously not every supply chain is going to look quite like this, and obviously this is a super, super simple one. So we have sort of the initial manufacturing, you have some logistics in between, you have a distributor or other sort of distribution channel, and then you have your customers. I think a lot of times what happens is people or companies map only in one direction. They only do the upstream part because they say, hey, we have this new requirement that requires some sort of upstream mapping. So they map the point of final manufacturer, they may map intermediate manufacturing, they may map raw material suppliers, but they're only looking upstream. We find that with a lot of businesses, especially in places like the technology industry, the electronics industry, and especially the pharmaceutical industry, it is just as important to map those downstream distribution chains. Once you can understand what those customer requirements are and where those risks may be present in your supply chain. And second, because that's where we see a lot of loss and disruption in those supply chains, is more on the downstream side rather than the upstream side, which, while it's not simple, certainly can be a bit easier to map and understand than the downstream portions of those supply chains. So that's point number one. The second point is to also make sure that you are mapping those logistics partners and the little in-between bits as well, especially if there's a lot of consolidation taking place, if there's a lot of other logistics activity taking place. What we've found is that regardless of the type of risk you're looking at, it means there's a lot of touches in that particular supply chain. So if you have a supply chain that has 3, 4, 5 movements, regardless of the type of risks that you're looking to map or understand, those are generally going to be higher risk supply chains. The freight is moving for a longer period of time. There's more actors involved in sort of touching and handling that freight. So there's more potential risk in those supply chains. Another thing you'll also want to look out for is concentration in the supply chain. So you can see this distributor in the middle here. There's 2 major supply chains that are going through that distributor. Their volume's higher there. It's probably likely that the value is higher there as well. So that's part of the supply chain mapping exercise as well, is you want to see where you have those concentrations in the supply chain. So to summarize, sort of the 3 tips or points that we'd have for mapping the supply chain is: 1, look both upstream and downstream. Don't ignore either one of those. Just depending on where you've had losses or because of your regulatory requirements, you want to map the whole thing. The second point is don't ignore the kind of in-between pieces where there may be multiple touches in between steps of the supply chain that otherwise you'd not map or ignore. That's typically where we see a lot of problems. And then the third is to look at these concentrations in the supply chain where you may have a lot of product or a lot of activity, a lot of volume in that area. Those may be areas where you want to pay a bit more attention depending on the type of risks that you're looking at. The good news is that once you've mapped out your supply chain in this way, and we typically recommend, going to your procurement teams, hey, who have we onboarded to do what types of activities in the past year, the past 2 years? Going to your supply chain teams, even looking for pulling information from an ERP system like an SAP or similar system to track movements in the supply chain. Who has sold what to who? Where did we take custody of this product? Where does the customer take custody of this product, whether that's a distributor or the end customer themselves, to really understand all of those links in the supply chain? Where is it taking place? How frequently is it taking place? At what volume and what value is it taking place? So working with those teams to really map out all parts of that supply chain. The good news is that once that is done, you'll have a really nice supply chain map that you'll be able to use for any number of different purposes. So it can help with sort of mapping your sustainability requirements. It can help with mapping supplier quality. And it gives you a really good sense of sort of who's doing what in the supply chain that you can then sort of act upon, right? The end goal is always to sort of get from, hey, every supplier is a risk. We don't know how much risk each supplier has, to then look at sort of, okay, here's the 20 suppliers that we know we should prioritize. either because of value, because of volume, or because of the risk in the activity that they're undertaking. So for example, if you're looking at sustainability, there may be certain high risk activities like tanneries, for example, or in cases where there's a lot of foreign migrant workers, you'll want to zoom in on sort of what those risks are. If you're looking at loss and disruption, there may be sort of, let's say long over the road freight trips, for example, that it's a single truck, 4 or 5 day transit from one end of Europe to the other, or one end of the United States to the other. That may be higher risk as well because your freight's in transit for a longer period of time. So depending on the types of risks you're looking at, once you've built that map, you'll be able to sort of identify, okay, this is a high risk for this type of activity, this is a high risk for this type of activity, and you'll have that more complete supply chain. The other thing that is really important to look at as well is sort of where are your blind spots? So do upstream mapping, do downstream mapping, focus on those concentrations, and then focus on the pieces in between was sort of the 3 points from that last slide. What you'll really see with that focus on the in-between bits that I think a lot of times get ignored in this type of supply chain mapping is that you'll realize that you don't have a whole lot of visibility into really important parts of the supply chain, even if they're really short in terms of the amount of time or the actual distances involved, for example. So I'll give an example here. We were helping a company that was based out of Guadalajara, Mexico. They were importing really high value chips from Asia. They were then going to an assembly plant in Guadalajara, Mexico. Should be no problem, right? The airport is about 2, 3, 4, 5 kilometers from that manufacturing site. Great, just put it on a truck. Should get there very quickly. 15 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever the case may be. As we dug deeper, we found that there were actually tons of problems in just that really, really small, short part of the supply chain. All of that activity was outsourced to a third-party logistics company, which usually works very well, helps reduce your costs. That's fantastic. You don't have to work with 3 or 4 different warehousing and trucking partners. But in this case, it meant they lost complete visibility into that part of the supply chain. So from the time it was in sort of customs clearance, loaded onto trucks, into a local hub warehouse, and then onto the factory site, they had no visibility into any of that. So we dug really, really deep, spent a whole week basically mapping out in excruciating detail those portions of the supply chain. How long is it sitting in customs clearance? Could that be a risk? What are the information security risks there? They were sending out lots of information about what shipments were coming in when. Is that tipping people off that could lead to loss or disruption? How is the trucking happening? How is it being loaded onto those vehicles? How are the drivers instructed in terms of driving? Where to go, how to go, all of that. What are the contingency plans if there is an incident or an issue en route? What's the security protocol at those warehouses or those local hubs? And then how does final transport to the actual campus work? And how can we just get much better visibility into that really, really tiny part of the supply chain? So that's an example of a more detailed area of mapping, right? I think people think of it as sort of this high level activity, and it absolutely can be, right? Where you're looking at the entire globe. And I'll give an example of that later, where you're looking at the entire globe, but it doesn't have to be, right? I think what you may do is do your high level mapping that says, hey, downstream, and this example is downstream or just slightly upstream, basically. We have this portion of the supply chain that we know is high risk. It's in Mexico. We know that's a fairly high risk country, and it's a lot of volume and a lot of value going through this one small part of the supply chain. Let's dig a bit deeper to get a really in-depth understanding of what's actually happening in the supply chain. So again, back to my earlier point, yes, it's about sort of understanding where your suppliers are, plotting them on a map, plotting them in some sort of software like BSI's screen software. But the really big part of this is understanding the actual process. Who's doing what, where, how are they doing it, and what are the times involved, the distances involved, and the risks involved in all different parts of that supply chain. So it's not just, I mean, it is that sort of high level mapping, but then there's also in areas of high risk, really digging deep into the individual activities that are taking place. You can see this on the sustainability side as well, for example, right? So let's say you have a factory that there's a large amount of raw materials that are going to that factory from a number of different points. You may want to get, and there's let's say maybe a higher proportion of foreign migrant workers in that factory. Those are what you know about that factory. You may want to do a deeper dive to understand where their raw materials are coming from, how they're getting to the factory, the actual processes that are taking place at that factory. Are they outsourcing any of the work? because that may be another indicator of risk. So there's a number of different places where you want to do that high level mapping, but then dig in where there may be greater issues based on the risk that you're seeing for that portion or that part of the supply chain. I'll just cover this very quickly. Again, the focus here is not necessarily on software or a tool. I think that is one of the mistakes a lot of times that we see companies make is they buy a tool without having the sort of organizational or process mapping piece of this ready to go. So, in general, we'd like to see that you do that sort of internal work that we talked about in the last session. So understanding who does what in the supply chain, who touches the supply chain from procurement, even including your legal compliance teams, your contracting teams through to your supply chain teams. Do that part first. Understand who touches the supply chain, get a good process for mapping your supply chain, and then move it into some sort of tool in order to scale it or make it a bit more real time. So I'll just give an example here of what BSI has done in some of these cases. We've linked together ERP systems, learning management systems in some cases to track sort of training through the supply chain, warehouse management systems and other IT systems like in-transit tracking, those kinds of things, into basically a knowledge graph or web that shows that sort of map of the supply chain. And then we overlay sort of our screen risk information on top of that. So that's a good example of sort of going through and mapping both the suppliers and the systems that keep information on those suppliers in order to build out a more complete map of the supply chain. So in this case, we were able to basically understand, okay, from Spain or Portugal, other parts of the Iberian Peninsula through to the UK, who is touching this freight, what is the risk associated with those transport partners, which this would have helped quite a bit with that Mexico example I gave you earlier, but really in mapping out the supply chain in detail and then overlaying the sort of digital or technical layer on top of it to get a better sense of what mapping in that supply chain looks like. So again, I don't want to linger here for too long or keep too much of the focus on the systems themselves. Again, what's really important here is this actual process. We mapped out what systems are tracking the supply chain, what groups are involved in the supply chain, and then we overlaid that technical and risk piece on top of it to give us a better sense of risk in the supply chain. So some of the benefits of this supply chain mapping, one is that it helps you with that really sort of ongoing risk assessment. What we see a lot in supply chain is people do a risk assessment once for one particular purpose. Okay, hey, we have this new requirement coming in. Our customer wants us to look at X, Y, and Z. Great, we'll map the supply chain. We'll do the risk assessment for that purpose. That's great, but it doesn't get you to sort of that sustainable long-term risk assessment that you need for your supply chain. So what we would say instead is maybe take a little bit more time, do the hard work of getting your internal teams together in procurement, supply chain, compliance, whoever else may be involved in the supply chain, do that hard work of getting them together, pull all the available data or look through all the available data, understand which systems hold that data, and then sort of really drive at building a supply chain map that you'll be able to keep updated. And that you'll be able to use for other purposes as well. It's one regulation today, it may be a different customer requirement tomorrow, it may be a completely changed distribution model. We saw that a lot in COVID, is that a lot more people started shipping direct to customer rather than through stores, and that changes the whole risk profile of their supply chains. So you want to have a risk mapping process that is sustainable but flexible enough that it allows you to do that kind of ongoing risk assessment to identify the highest areas of risk sort of on the go as conditions change, and that keeps track of sort of importance to your company in terms of the regulation, level of risk, the criticality of that supplier, and then other factors that you can incorporate such as volume or value of that supplier as well. And as I mentioned, that'll help you sort of create that scalable risk assessment process. And from there, you'll be able to understand, okay, we need to really work on these 4, 5, 10, 20, 200 suppliers out of the 1,500 that we have as sort of a first step, basically, after we do this mapping. So once you've got that mapping in place, you can begin thinking about sort of supply chain risk mitigations. So what types of mitigations could you put in place? Would you stop using a supplier if it showed up as high risk enough? Probably not, but that's one measure that you could use. You could use audit, self-assessment. You can get down on the ground and do sort of supplier improvement programs with the suppliers that you've identified as critical or high priority, number of different activities. And so that's what the supply chain mapping allows you to do, is then sort of build out that process or where you're going to go next in terms of managing risk in the supply chain. So I'll close here with another case study. We closed our first example with a case study of sort of getting together those internal groups and working on managing supply chain risk, putting a sustainable process in place. From here, what we did is we took this company that was a large retailer. They had about 2,300 suppliers that they had engaged with just in the previous quarter, I believe it was, and they had quite a bit of churn in that supplier base as well. So what we did was we went and looked at it, said, okay, mapped out that supply chain of these 2,300 suppliers, which ones are going to pose the greatest risk, which ones are located in places that are high risk, which ones perform high risk activities. So for this case, because it was focused around cargo security, we looked at, well, where are those stuffing locations? But then we also did look at factors like forced labor, human rights as well, to understand for those factories, they're doing high risk activities as well. If they had a lot of outsourced work at those factories, that presented as a higher risk. So looking at all those different factors to build that complete risk in the supply chain, we ended up with a really focused list of about 122 suppliers that we wanted to go out and audit over the next couple of quarters. So that really helped with sort of focusing that risk assessment activity and that risk mitigation activity. And another, I guess, sort of really important outcome of this is that we engaged with their buying offices and built that relationship between their compliance and buying office compliance team and buying offices. Again, in order to make this a more sustainable solution. So now that buying team, whenever they have new suppliers that they're onboarding, they're going to the compliance team and saying, hey, can you map this risk for us? Hey, we've seen an issue with X, Y, or Z in this region. Can you maybe dig in on that a little bit, engage with that supplier in some way through an audit or an improvement program or some training? So beyond just sort of the value of mapping out the supply chain and just sort of understanding where there was greatest risk in the supply chain, we also saw that it helped sort of knit those two internal groups together in a way that helps them better and more proactively address risk moving into the future. So I will leave everybody with that case study. Again, thank you for joining. Just as a reminder, there will be a part 3 to this that actually talks about once you've got your internal ducks in a row, you've mapped out your supply chain and the risk in that supply chain, now you're ready to go and engage with suppliers. What do you do there? How do you do that? And how do you make sure that that is sustainable over time as well? And perhaps most importantly, how do you measure the impact of all of this? How do you make sure that it's working? How do you show to your executives, to your leadership, to your customers, to your buyers, that this is all working, that it's improving over time? And then how do you make tweaks as you go if something is not working or if you need a better or different approach? That's what our third session will be focused on. So please join us for that session as well. Thank you for joining for this one.